welcome everyone. And today I have the pleasure of introducing Helen Longino. Helen is from the University of Stanford, and she works in feminist philosophy, philosophy of science, philosophy of social science. She's the author of several interesting, very influential papers and books. She wrote 3 books. One is The Science as Social Knowledge, another one, The Fate of Knowledge, and more recently, Studying Human Behavior. And today she's going to talk about individuals or populations, how scale matters. Welcome.
Thanks very much. And thank you, those who are coming for a second talk. Thank you for returning. Thank you again to the Rotman for inviting me to give these 2 talks here today. And as I promised yesterday, today I'm going to talk about issues in the conceptualization of behavior. So I'm talking from this recent book, Studying Human Behavior, How Scientists Investigate Aggression and Sexuality. And the project is the same project I described yesterday, namely to engage in a comparative analysis of social, ontological, and epistemological dimensions of the scientific study of human behavior. And I've focused in this on empirical research, so not on, I did, of course, I looked at a lot of programmatic claims on behalf of different research approaches, but I was looking primarily at research papers, and I looked at research papers in order to maintain some kind of continuity and a basis of comparison on 2 families of behavior, research on aggression and research on sexual orientation. And the approaches that I reviewed were quantitative behavior genetics, molecular behavior genetics, neurophysiological behavioral research, social environmentally oriented behavioral research, and some integrative approaches that attempt to study the interaction of different factors that are studied in these single factor systems like behavior genetics or social environmental behavior research. And of those, I looked at developmental systems theory, the gene by environment by neurobiology approach of Avshalom Caspi and Terry Moffat, and a multifactorial approach developed by Ken Kendler. And in the book, I argued for a pluralist thesis regarding the interrelations of these different approaches, and that was my talk yesterday. Today, I want to talk about how the behavior, how the phenomenon to be investigated gets conceptualized, and then reflect on the social life of the research. Before I started this work, it was common especially among political people who were concerned about research in the biology of behavior, whether genetically oriented research or neurophysiologically oriented research, to think that from a political problem point of view, the problem is a kind of determinist and reductionist approach to behavior. So the problem was genetic research per se, or neurophysiological research per se. And as I got more deeply into looking at this work, it seemed to me that that's really not the problem at all, because if we're worried about determinism, the social environment approach is just as deterministic as the genetic approach. So that's not the issue. But it seems to me that there are issues in the way in which at least some behaviors, and it turns out the behaviors that I was looking at get conceptualized, that are politically problematic. And so that's the punchline at the end of the talk. And you'll see hints all the way through. But okay, so in focusing on aspects of concept formation and ontology, I want to talk about a couple of things. I want to talk about the ways in which concepts are constructed for actual study in behavioral sciences through operationalization and measurement, and talk about the factors that go into these operationalizations and the construction of what I call an object of inquiry. And then I want to talk about, as an aspect on part 3 there, the interaction of internal and contextual aspects of the research, and then some of the social consequences of the circulation of the research in the broader world outside the world of science. And in the course of that, I want to draw our attention to some possible ontological alternatives that in studying behavior that often get overlooked, especially when we're focusing on these biological approaches. So, okay. Moving to part 1. Well, when we're going to study something, obviously, I think you all know this, we have to find features of the phenomenon that we're studying that are actually accessible to things like measurement. So we start with some vague idea of what it is that we want to study, but we have to identify the features of that phenomenon that we can actually measure, that we can identify and re-identify as being of the same kind, so that we can ascertain, for example, the frequencies of their occurrence. Now, I don't know why in animals is bigger, but you know, it's not the fault of that machine. It's the fault of my attempts at revision and trying to get a common font throughout this PowerPoint. But never mind. A lot of the biological research, of course, starts as research in animals. Biological research doesn't start from the get-go as research on humans, and this is true of behavioral research as much as medical research. Looking at the work on aggression, aggression in animals can be operationalized as various kinds of stereotyped motor behaviors, and these will usually be particular to particular species of animals. So different species of rodent, for example, will have different stereotyped motor behaviors that are elicited in certain kinds of social interaction. So flank marking, for example, pawing at the flank, is a motor behavior that is associated with aggression for certain species of rodent. Another kind of behavior that can be observed is what an animal does when you introduce a conspecific into a cage in which you've placed the animal. Does the animal cower? Does it retreat? Or does it advance aggressively? And what kinds of interventions on the animal's physiology or genetic structure can increase the frequency of either cowering in the back or advancing in an aggressive manner on the intruder. Another form of aggression that gets studies is maternal aggression, that is the protective aggression that female animals will engage in to protect their young. We all know that we should not, when we're hiking, go in between a bear and her cubs, because we'll really be in trouble. Sexual competition is another form of behavior that's studied, and there are others. And animals can be observed in the wild, but more commonly, and most of our knowledge about animal behavior comes from intervention on laboratory animals. It's harder and harder to find animals in the wild these days. So that carries over into research on aggression in humans, but of course, humans don't have quite the same behavior patterns as animals do. And so other indices are used to measure aggression, to measure instances of aggression, which, as I'll indicate later, are taken as evidence of a disposition to aggressive behavior. So what, if you just look at the research, what is getting counted as a behavior that counts as evidence of an aggressive disposition? Well, conviction of violent crime is one. Fighting in prison is another. Fighting in prison is good because, why? Prisoners are confined, they're under observation all the time, and so you can watch what they do. Of course, you can't watch everything that they do. We understand that. Another criterion is instances of delinquent behavior, and that can often include truancy and drug use. Flying into violent rages, whether these are verbal or physical, expressions of anger, irritability, verbal aggression in a laboratory or clinical context, engaging in kind of assaultive behavior towards a proxy, like a doll, engaging in assault of some kind, not against a doll or a proxy, but against another person. Finally, another kind of index that's used is diagnosis of antisocial personality or oppositional defiant disorder or childhood conduct disorder, or the score on some kind of psychological testing instrument, and there are bunches of them. I'll just list them there. Now, the assumption is that all of these indices are measuring the same behavioral disposition, right? Aggression. And sometimes they do distinguish delinquency and aggression, understanding, of course, that truancy is not aggressive behavior, but not always. And reviews of the research, which were also part of my evidential base, often tend to include both delinquency and aggression. So these are the indices. How are they actually measured? Well, the behavioral indexes can be measured by the report of others, whether parents or teachers. So a researcher can go into a school and kind of ask a teacher about the behaviors of class participants. Parents are often asked to report in a clinical context and not in a general study context, but parent report, teacher report, self-report. So self-report is, of course, the answers that a subject gives on those various psychological testing instruments. Clinical observation. So what a researcher observes of behavior in a clinical context, or public records, so things like crime, delinquency, and so forth, or experience of abuse as a child. This is all information that is gleaned from public records, records of arrest, records of conviction, and so forth. And the research effort is to associate the frequency of or variation in one of these measured behavioral indices in the members of a study population with genetic, hormonal, neuronal, social factors, or some combination of those. And of course, when you look at that list, you can see immediately that there would be some empirical issues that you'd be worried about. And of course, I draw on my own experience in the United States, so forgive me for my provinciality on this score. Canadians may be different on some of these issues, but for example, maybe they're better on selectivity of arrest, conviction, and so forth. But in the U.S., it's just common knowledge that arrest is racially biased. It's become more salient to us as a result of recent events that have may then use, I'm sure here as well as down there. Conviction and incarceration are economically biased. Those who can afford a good lawyer will tend to get lower sentences, will tend to get convicted with less frequency than those who are forced through economic circumstances to rely on public defenders, who are often given huge caseloads and just don't have the time to develop a good defense in the way that a well-paid lawyer is going to be able to do. So there's using the public records of arrest, criminal conviction, and so forth is kind of selectively problematic if we're trying to understand something about the, if we're trying to use those as indices of aggression. As I already noted, delinquency, but also antisocial personality disorder include in their criteria non-aggressive and non-violent behavior. So again, using a diagnosis of antisocial behavior is problematic, given that one can satisfy, because it's a menu, it's a criteria for antisocial personality are a menu. You have to satisfy some n, 5 out of 7 or 4 out of 7 of a set of criteria, and so you can meet the conditions by, for example, not being truthful all the time, not being able to hold a steady job, and so forth, because these are all conditions of antisocial personality. And then one might ask about the relation of things like rage and irritability to aggression or violence. And I say, well, talk about psychological violence as opposed to physical violence. See, I do that one correctly. But there's an issue there to discuss. And finally, and this is an empirical issue that people get concerned about, is that there can be systematic variation in third-party answers, that is, parent and teacher answers to psychological inventories, where parents will offer different assessments of behavior than teachers will. And you just see this in the inventories that they fill out. Eric Turkheimer has done a systematic study of the variation that you get in third-party answers. So those are some of the empirical issues, and you might also say, well, there aren't some things missing from those indices. We're not looking at state-sanctioned aggression or violence, for example, military violence, or we're not looking at state-overlooked, not necessarily sanctioned, but overlooked aggression or violence, the aggression of correctional officers, for example. We're not looking at the violence to communities that's caused by corporate, the harm to communities that's caused by corporate negligence, or the deliberate prioritization of certain values over others. So that kind of raises a question about how or what the operationalization of aggression in the ways that you find them in the research, what does that reveal about the way aggression and violence are being understood? And it seems that the problem is conceptualized as the unsanctioned infliction of harm by an individual on another individual. Aggression and violence are understood as individual behaviors or individual dispositions to behave that are internal to or proper to the individual. And so to understand the etiology of behavior is to understand how individual dispositions are inculcated. Turning to sexual behavior, again, the animal research focuses on the expression of male typical or female typical behavior in non-human animals, where mounting is a male typical and lordosis is a female typical. It's a presentation of the rump. Again, you can manipulate the expression of this behavior through manipulating hormones and at various stages of development of the animals. And sexual orientation is understood either as the sex of the animal towards which mounting or low dress is displayed, or the display of sex atypical behavior. Right? So when males can be induced into presenting in lordosis, or females can be induced into engaging in mounting behavior, or just display mounting behavior. Turning to humans, okay, so and what's good about this? Well, these are all things you can count, right? You can measure their frequency, you can measure their incidence. Turning to humans, sexual orientation was, when it was first being studied, understood as either heterosexual or homosexual. Alfred Kinsey introduced actually 7 grades of sexual orientation, from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual, but these intermediate positions made it possible to, or theoretically made it possible to acknowledge bisexuality, for example. But as it happens, when you look at the research, researchers actually look for, look at exclusively heterosexual and exclusively homosexual behavior because they're trying to associate some measurable behavioral phenomenon with some other phenomenon that's operating on or in the individual, whether it's genetic variation or so forth. So, so the intermediate categories get absorbed into the extremes. Now, there are other ways to think about sexual orientation besides the sexual identity of the potential partner. Sex researchers Whalen, Geary, and Johnson have, for example, said, well, here are some other dimensions of variation. The degree of arousability, the frequency of sexual interaction. There's lots of variation along this dimension. Number of partners that one has, whether synchronically or diachronically. And these are orthogonal to things like the sexual identity of the partner, right? You can want to have lots of different partners of the same sex, of the different sex, or of any sex, not to mention other aspects of variation. Okay, so we in both these cases we have specific ways of measuring the occurrence of a behavior, which is then evidence of a disposition of some kind. Now, what's going on? Well, we start, first of all, it seems to me, with some public phenomenon of interest, which we might call the intended object of research. That is, what is it that we want to investigate? And as generally conceived, it's pretty vague and imprecise. I mean, what in our public discourse, can we really specify exactly what aggression is? Can we really specify what sexual orientation is, especially when you see the ways in which the degrees of intermediacy and so forth. So a concept has to be made precise through the specification of measurable indices of the kind that we were just looking at. And these operationalizations create what I'm calling a studyable object or an object of inquiry, and the operationalizations also redefine the concept that we're using to talk about the public phenomenon in which we are interested. And that object of inquiry is what's putatively measured by the operationalizations. And the other language that we might have is a construct that's often used by psychologists in talking about the objects of their study, or an abstract common object. But the point is that there's a semantic process that transforms the public phenomenon, the intended object, into an abstract common object. And it does so through selective elimination of features in the intended object of research to what can be measurable, and a reaggregation of those features with other features that are similarly measurable. So in the behavioral research on aggression, sexual orientation, also gender and others, I think there are at least three aspects that are interacting in this semantic process. There's the shared context of origin, that is how it is that we get interested in understanding the phenomenon in the first place, our folk psychology. There are requirements for creating a studyable object of inquiry, namely the issues of repeatability and so forth. And finally, there are some ontological presuppositions at work. If we look at the shared context of origin, why are we interested in studying behavior in the first place? Is it just something that out there that is there to be studied? No. We're interested in studying human behavior because we want to understand ourselves and others. And we're also, there are behaviors, and it's not just because we want to understand ourselves and others, that's a very nice goal, but there are also behaviors that we find problematic in various ways. And so a lot of the behavioral research is directed towards behavior that is identified as problematic in some way. The aggression research being an example of that, because the aggression research is intended to help us understand crime and criminality. That is the way it's presented. It's supported by, in many cases, by criminology, departments of justice, and so forth. I won't go into that now. We have in our ordinary interactions with each other, we have a system of classifying and explaining actions, and a system that coordinates with our practices of moral judgment. And these, I think, persist, although in a muted way, as the studyable object gets created. And you see that through the selection of the particular indices that are used. As far as the requirements of a studyable object, well, when we're trying to study some phenomenon, we need to be able to isolate the phenomenon that can be studied. We want to distinguish the behavior from its environment, from its surround. And we want something that can be reliably identified as being of the kind that it is, and re-identified so that the frequency of the phenomenon can be measured. And that's why you have the kinds of indices that I listed earlier. And the behaviors are decontextualized, right, in the course of this. So we don't bring the context in which the behavior occurs into what we're measuring, because that would give us too many different kinds of behavior. Behavior occurs in many different contexts. So we strip the context away, and we try to come up with event types that we take, again, to be expressive of individual dispositions, and that we can represent as participating in natural regularities, right? So that we can represent them as participating in regularities involving genetic configuration or hormonal secretions or so forth. And so the behaviors first are decontextualized, and then they're recontextualized and classified with other phenomena that can be measured in the same ways or in the same set of ways. And as a consequence, you have in review articles a listing of the kinds of behaviors that can be understood by approach X, whether it's a behavior genetic approach or a molecular approach or a social environment approach, but more with these biological approaches, because those are the review articles that I've been thinking, and this is the kind of classification that's given. So with those biological approaches, you find behavior like sexual orientation, aggression classified with things like Huntington's disease, or if we're doing genetics, cystic fibrosis, right? So that's a reclassification and a recontextualization of the behavior as the kind of thing that is like these disease states. Huntington's is an affliction of the nervous system that produces uncontrollable motor behavior. Aggression is just like that, given that approach. Okay, and as far as shared ontological presupposition, we find a kind of methodological individualism in that the behavior of groups or populations is understood as the aggregate of behaviors of individuals, and so best studied at the individual level. And causation is understood as internal to the individual. So aggression as an object of inquiry becomes an individual act of harm that's directed against another individual, originating in or expressive of some trait internal to the agent. And harm and criminality, as well as other behaviors, get associated through their operationalizations. And other forms of harm, those forms of harm, get eliminated from consideration. So that kind of gives us this picture. We can start, if we think of aggressive behavior, that includes a lot of behavior. But in the end, what we learn about is behavior that falls into the square that's highlighted there. Do the same thing with sexuality. Sexuality studied as bimodal sexual orientation, and that aligns human sexuality with laboratory animal sexuality. So some of you may remember an infamous paper that was published, I'm not sure anymore how long ago it was, but it was possible to subject the one of the genes of Drosophila to heat stress, and the consequence was that the male Drosophila formed a chain with each animal mounting the successive animal, and this was taken to be potentially informative of human sexual orientation. So that's the alignment that I'm talking about. There are other forms of alignment as well, not quite so extraordinary. As an object of inquiry, the space of intersection of sex of erotic object and other dimensions of erotic orientation is emptied, and the space between the extremes is absorbed into the extremes. So really what you're studying is Kinsey 1 and Kinsey 7. Everything else is by the by. So, so I want to claim that what's going on, and maybe this is evident to you, but what's going on here interacts with processes that are external to the research in ways that are problematic. And here I'm going to focus really on aggression, the aggression research. I'll probably say something about sexual orientation, except I'm running out of time, I see, so maybe I won't. So my strategy in this part is to take a social phenomenon that we're relatively familiar with and make some suggestions about how the creation of a studyable object interacts with that social phenomenon. So, And of course, this is very much drawing on a U.S. context. So once again, I apologize to those Canadians who don't experience the same kinds of social situations, but consider this informative.
You're okay.
Okay, so what's the phenomenon? Well, implicit bias studies have been revealing that, among other things, both Euro-American and African-American subjects, although African-American to a lesser extent than Euro-American, associate African-American men with danger and hence possible aggression against the subject. And I'm sure some of you know some of these studies. You know, you show photographs of individuals in exactly the same geographic location, in exactly the same posture, and you ask, okay, where in the pocket? So, you know, but anyway, the hand is in the pocket. And is moving out, and you say, so what's that one? What's that one pulling out of the pocket? Cell phone. What's that one pulling out of the pocket? Gun. So it's the white individual is pulling out a cell phone. The African American individual is pulling out a gun. That's the perception. Anyway, you never see the object. You just see the movement. And there are lots of studies that of this kind that show that, on the whole, we, regardless of our professed and consciously felt attitudes about race, we carry these implicit associations with us. So we carry implicit bias that it's implicit. We don't recognize it. We don't experience it in ourselves. Okay, so well, why would any of what I was talking about have anything to do with that? Okay, that's the question. Okay, well, what's going on internally to the research context? We have the operationalization that I've been describing, and the frequent operationalization of aggression as conviction of violent crime, the salience of aggressive or violent behavior in the conceptualization of crime. And here we might note that those white-collar crimes, whether that's the actions of bankers or of tobacco manufacturers or whatever, didn't get included in behavioral indices of aggression. Of course, those contexts are so complicated, it's very difficult to tease out and find something measurable there. The operationalization, the salience, and the goals of the research. Aggression is studied in the context of an interest in understanding crime and violence. Right? Why do we want to know about aggression? Well, we want to reduce the incidence of crime. We want to reduce the incidence of violence. What's going on in the social context? Well, first of all, in the US, we have an extreme overrepresentation of African Americans, especially men, in state and federal prisons, and now joined by Latinos in being overrepresented. We also have a tendency to conflate incarceration, that is, having been incarcerated, with a tendency towards aggression and violence. This came out quite clearly a couple of years ago in California, when the state was ordered to begin releasing prisoners, or the state determined that the only way to reduce overcrowding, which it was mandated to do, right, by the federal government, because conditions in prisons were so ghastly. The only way to reduce the prison population was to start reducing individuals. And of course, you know, nobody was going to release murderers or thugs. So the idea was you would release nonviolent individuals whose sentence, I mean, they were going to be sensible about the way they did, but there was enormous resistance to this strategy of easing conditions in prisons by releasing prisoners, because, oh, they are the worst of the worst. Right? So there's this kind of immediate thought that those who are incarcerated are there because they've done the kinds of things we see reported on the evening news. Right? They're the ones who are guilty for the kind of mayhem and the individual assaults and so forth that are reported in the news. There's also a tendency in the media to emphasize the research findings of genetic and, to a lesser extent, neurobiological associations with aggression and violence. So this is an issue that deserves more discussion in terms of evidence, but trust me, I do have evidence for this, and maybe most of you also have evidence that that the findings that get reported about behavior in the media are genetic and neurobiological findings. Finally, there's also not just what goes on in the present, but some historical factors operating here, namely a history of attributing group traits to shared genetic factors. And I was just reading in the newspaper that they gave me at the hotel about some studies that have just been done, and that headline was, I'm sure you saw it too if you looked at the paper, poor children have smaller brains. This is a study of the effects of poverty on children and on learning. And although the researchers are not making this association, this is the association that is going to be made. That poverty is just the old Bert claim that the poor are poor because they don't have what it takes to advance in our kind of society. Rather than thinking the children of the poor have smaller brains because they're undernourished, they live in households that are under stress, I mean, all these kinds of things. So, and the researchers wanted to talk about those factors, but there's also this history that they're aware of, and they had no way of actually directing the reader or the writer of the newspaper article to which of those types of explanation might be the better explanation. It was all expressed aspirationally. We hope that it's okay. So I want to claim that the combination of the internal structure of the aggression research, namely the ways in which aggression is operationalized and the goals of that research, and the social context in which the research is acquiring its social meaning, perpetuates the cultural association of racial identity and probable or potential aggressivity, violence, and criminality. So it's all of these together that do this. It's not the research by itself, but it's features of the context in which or into which the research flows. And I think that this has obviously prejudicial consequences for the prejudicial treatment of African Americans and African American men, especially independently of their behavior. It has consequences for attitudes towards the incarcerated, our toleration of abysmal conditions in prisons, our attitudes towards released felons. I don't know what the situation is in Canada, but in almost every state in the United States, felons lose their rights to vote even after they've been released from prison. They've paid their debt to society, but they're not permitted to actually fully participate as citizens in their public world. And they experience employment difficulties, housing difficulties, and so forth. My Stanford colleague, Jennifer Eberhardt, who also works on implicit bias, has recently done research showing that white support for, that is, Euro-American support for prison reform depends on the perception of the racial makeup of the prison population. I mean, you can figure out what kinds of studies are done to show this. So we've got this kind of persistent association of criminality and race. Yeah, and finally, given our continued racial segregation and the overwhelming proportion of African American men in prison, there are consequences for the continuing deprivation and alienation of African Americans, especially in inner cities. And I'm not saying that the research is done out of racist motivations. I don't think that racism even has anything to do with shaping the research, but rather it's a combination of factors that are both internal to and external to the research that reinforce or at least fail to contest already existing social prejudices. Okay, now I'm just going to skip that. Yeah, sexy, but we don't have time. One thing to note, of course, is the methodological individualism that was involved in the construction of indices. Namely, we're interested in how genes, hormonal exposures, and so forth increase the frequency of operationalized expressions of the behaviors of interest, and those are all measured as properties of individuals. So one might wonder, well, are there other ways to think about these phenomena? And, well, we can use slightly different language for some of the things that get studied. We can think about arrests for assault. Now, arresting involves an arrestor and an arrestee. Right? We can think about reported assaults. Assaults involve an assaulter and an assaultee. Incidents of fighting, it takes at least two to fight. Quarrels, it takes at least two to quarrel. I suppose one can quarrel with oneself, but one generally can't quite quarrel violently with oneself. Similarly with sexual orientation, we can think in terms, we can kind of change our language to things like, because of course sex takes, well, no, it doesn't just take two or more. I have examples right below. But we can think in terms of same-sex coupling, heterosex coupling, couplings in context of committed relationships, one-time casual couplings. I mean, these are all other ways of labeling sexual interactions, sexual behavior. We can think of celibacy, that is the refraining from sexual behavior. We can think of onanism, which is, of course, a sexual relation with oneself, masturbation, that is. Now, the point is that these are all interactions, and they involve individuals, but they don't denote properties of individuals, qua individuals, but rather interactional events or event types. And these categorizations lend themselves to investigation through other research approaches. If we take interactions as ontologically basic, we can change how we think about the phenomena that we are investigating. So we can move to thinking about the frequencies of event types in populations and the distributions of event types in populations. And then we can ask about things like changes in the relative frequencies of episodes or interaction types over time, in different forms of community, in different societies, and in different kinds of societies. Yeah, this is the one I was trying to change, but the point is that when we're focusing on changes in relative frequencies and distributions of behaviors, the phenomenon to be studied is a population property, not a property of individuals. We're still studying behavior, but we're studying it at a population level. And doing that, we can then investigate the association of frequency of investigation, the association of variation among populations in things like the frequency of violent interactions, the distribution of violent interactions across different regions, frequency of arrests, the distribution of arrests across different regions, the frequency and distribution of recidivism. We're just thinking about crime, for example. And we can think about, ask about the association of these frequencies with the frequency of other population level phenomena. Features of the physical environment, for example. Features of the resource base, whether it's stable, whether it's shrinking or expanding. Climate, whether climate is stable, whether climate is tropical, desert, or Arctic, whether climate is changing. We know climate's changing. We can associate it with features of the physical environment, and also with features of social structure, which are again population level properties. The distribution of police resources, patterns of neighborly interaction, distribution of employment opportunities, distribution of income levels and wealth, access to housing, division of labor. Again, these are all properties of populations, not properties of individuals. And the point is to associate these population level properties with frequencies and distributions of behavior in populations. Age structure and kinship structure, again. So going back to my first slide about the approaches reviewed, the one in gray now is that approach of population or ecological approaches to understanding human behavior. And for those who were there yesterday, here's a table that kind of shows the differences between the approaches I was talking about yesterday. And so yesterday I was talking in particular about the taking a pluralist stance towards these different approaches, all of which are focused on understanding individual difference. And many researchers in this tradition will think that population level properties are simply the aggregate effect of individual dispositions produced by some one or more of these research approaches. But we can see that also if we think of population level properties in this ecological way, there are also alternative approaches that can be employed. We can be looking at features of the physical environment. We can be looking at features of the social structure as well. So I haven't done the same kind of analysis of those as I have of the work on individuals. That's something for the future. But the point is that it's there. So let me just make a couple of summary points, and then we can have a conversation about all this. So first of all, the intended object of research, that is the phenomenon investigated, is not identical to what we might call the common abstract object or the studyable object, which is shared by a set of research approaches. So those research approaches all measure behavior in the same way. Where they differ is in that with which they want to associate the behavior. The intended object is the object as publicly understood, the object that incurs our interest in the first place. The common abstract or the studyable object is defined through a set of measurable operationalizations. the research that's done produces at best partial knowledge of a limited subset of the behaviors of interest, those that are identical to the measurable operations. It doesn't tell us anything about the behaviors that are not accessible through those indices. A conflation of the common abstract object with the studyable object, that is a conflation, no, how am I saying that? The conflation of the intended phenomenon with a studyable object obscures the particularity and possible limited generalizability of the empirical studies. The common abstract object is constructed partially from ordinary language concepts. That is, aggression is still the topic of interest. Aggression appears both in our ordinary language and in the scientific language. And features of the meaning and valence of the term persist in the way it's operationalized. When the science is exported back to the public, it reinforces the dichotomies that exist in ordinary language. Concept formation about behavioral categories in science and ordinary language doesn't create, but it reinforces belief in inherent group differences. And the focus on the studyable object or the common abstract object, variation in measurable individual behavior, marginalizes alternative non-individualistic approaches. And the implicit point in all this is that those alternative non-individualistic, more ecological approaches may be the ones that are really going to be useful if what we're interested in is reducing crime. Thanks. You know who they are, and I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've met many, but. Okay.
Hi, thank you. So, one of the debates that's been going on in the Rotman lunchroom over the course of this semester has been the usefulness of inactive, embodied, or extended mind approaches. And so Robert's not here today, I don't see him, unfortunately, but he's been pressing very much against these as a genuine research program, because it doesn't seem to offer any kind of way to operationalize and follow that up in most of the scientific contexts. So when we're in labs with neuroscientists, we rarely see inactive or embodied or extended approaches driving research at all. And so your suggestion that these group level things looks a lot like extended mind types of descriptions of certain phenomena, but there's a huge barrier to operationalizing those. So how do you see sort of ecological perspectives as enabling operationalization of the kinds of research programs that look very fruitful, but also seem to be very difficult to bring into laboratory settings?
Okay, so I have to confess that I don't know that much about, I mean, I know something about extended mind and so forth, but I haven't really thought about what you would do in a genuine investigative context. But I think that that the challenge for those who think that conceptualization of mental events, states, is relevant to neuroscience, you have to face the challenge of, and you can't just say there's no way to operationalize, or you just have to be creative about how you go about, what indices you're going to use. And it may involve, just just thinking about, moving to thinking about interactions. What it may involve, maybe it's not something you can, the index may not be something that is an individual property, right? The index may have to be a relation between the state, the identifiable state of the individual and some external, some feature external to the individual. What was the other? The first one is inactive.
Yeah.
Minds at rest.
Oh, sorry, En.
En. Okay.
Enacted. Sorry.
Sorry. Okay.
My
All right.
Canadian accent is getting
Yeah.
in the way.
My hearing. And what's that?
It's, so there's embodied, enactive is sort of the activities that one does that permit cognition of some kind, as opposed to taking cognition as sort of a in the head, non-moving kind of mental state.
I see.
So it involves more, and it involves sort of non-computational states in some ways. And, this again this is not my field. This is a good friend of mine's field that I talked to.
Okay, I'm not going to say anything about that because I don't know enough about what to say. But as far as but I do have a view actually about the relation of mentality and neuroscience. It's just a view. It's not anything I have an argument for, except I think it's the way to understand minds. And because I think a lot of research is looking for causal relations between neurophysiological states and psychological states. And I think we're going to be in much better shape if we take something more like a constitutive view, where we think of psychological states as constituted of neurophysiological states rather than caused by them. So what neurophysiological states cause are other neurophysiological states, which themselves constitute different psychological states. But I need to do a whole lot more work to actually make that into a plausible, philosophically plausible. I mean, it is a philosophically plausible view, but actually give some arguments for it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I have a question about how you can actually apply the ecological stuff to humans, and in principle, I'm very much on board. I just, two things that maybe you can tell us a little bit more about. So the first is, in ecology, the idea of a population is much more, enough people can decide on it to actually go and do studies. I'm not saying they all agree, but there's groups of individuals that interact in very specific ways at very specific times in very specific areas. And you can delineate that and separate it from that other group of individuals that do all those things. So that's one thing that I'm worried about. How does that work with humans? Because if you're, the thing that I'm thinking about is if you're thinking about, people in prisons, that's a very sort of artificial kind of population. That's not a problem in itself, but they also interact with other conspecifics in this case in a way that they wouldn't if they were sort of, an ecological population. So that's one thing. The second thing, which has, again, to do with the notion of populations in ecology, is that the interactions themselves tend to be less particular, right? They're not, each interaction of one individual with another is less special or less particular. You can make abstractions over the relations in a way which, can you do with humans? What it means to be individualistic.
You probably can. Just to this last part, because I think there's more to your question, but I think that's this process of decontextualization, right? That happens in looking at individual behavior as much as it's going to take place in looking at human interactions. So if the problem is the particularity of of human actions or interactions. It doesn't matter whether you're thinking about individuals or individual behaviors or interactions. That the challenge is to find ways to separate the phenomenon you're interested in from the context in which it occurs, which gives it its particularity.
Yeah, so I guess what I was worried about is if you leave out all of that stuff from the human interactions, are you left with something which occurs often enough to be able to study?
In interactions?
Yes.
So I was trying to suggest, that there are, something like arrest, right? Independent of context, arrest. What else did I have? I had conviction. I had reports of assault, or whatever. I mean, you can count those independently of the context in which they occur. And then the question that's interesting is, once you're thinking abstractly in this way, what becomes interesting is how, when the frequencies of these interactions vary in different populations, what else is different at the population level that is associable with the interaction, the variation in interaction. So, I think there's always going to be some loss through decontextualization, which is required in order to have something that's re-identifiable as being of the same type. So you have to have a description at some level of abstraction. Yeah. Yeah, you have to keep track of it, because I can't.
Yeah, so thanks very much for the talk. It's fascinating on a number of levels. So I think, because this was touching on this, but I'm here to answer, so I'll ask the question again anyway. I don't mean this by way of criticism, but just by way of really identifying how difficult getting meaningful categories is in creating an object of study. Is there a worry that however we define human populations with so many different degrees of variation, that we won't reintroduce some of the very biases we're trying to abstract over by looking at population studies? Right, we could do it through Facebook. We could define a population. We could define a population through a city, through a country. There's so many different ways. Do you have ideas about what the right level of quantification for populations is for these kinds of studies?
No, and I'm not sure there is a right one. I think instead that when you're engaging in comparison of populations, you have to be doing the comparison at the same level. So if you're doing a study of neighborhoods, then the comparison has to be among neighborhoods. If you're doing countries, you have to be talking about kind of different political entities of a certain kind. Cities, the same thing. So I think, we can distinguish, if we think hard enough, and I'm not going to be able to do it right now, we can think about all the ways in which we can identify kinds of populations, and then figure out criteria of individuation at those, I hate the language of levels, but I'm going to be forced to do that now. And understanding, of course, that populations overlap. There are populations that are nested within larger populations. So, I think population, in this sense, when we're thinking especially about humans, but I also am willing to say that about non-human biological populations, is that population is really a kind of loose term, and you just have to be really specific. It's not that we want the definition of population so much as we want to be sure in our research that we are comparing like with like, rather than like with unlike, in thinking about comparing frequencies and so forth.
I was just wondering if you could say something about the fact that it's often reductive approaches that end up getting a lot of airtime in the media and in our society, and I was wondering if you lessen that a bit?
So yesterday I talked about collaborations between philosophy and sociology, and this is one of those areas where collaboration would be really helpful in answering that question. And as for why, any answer to the question why on my part would be speculative. I think that, first of all, we have a kind of, not just an attraction towards methodological individualism, but I think, again, I'm speaking as somebody from south of the border, in the United States, we have a very strong individualist ethos, generally. So I think that's one of the reasons, that helps to explain why the population approach gets less press than any of the individualistic approaches. But what you were asking about, I think, was why, say, the genetic approaches get more airtime than social environment oriented approaches. And I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I think it's a function of history. If you kind of look at the history of the research itself, there have been cycles, at least in the U.S., or kind of oscillation between research that emphasizes genetic and biological determinants of research and research that emphasizes social environmental determinants of research. Genetic research since 1953 has exploded in a way that's revealed, has been extraordinarily useful in many research contexts. So it has dominated a lot of biology itself, and not just biology and behavior. So there's just a great interest in what can be learned by studying genes. When we're thinking about behavior, I also think that we have a history of racist thinking that wants to associate certain kinds of properties that are typical of subgroups in a society with their, especially with their genetic makeup. So looking for genetic similarities among African Americans, for example, that would explain, actually supposing those genetic differences exist, that explain differences in performance on various standardized kinds of tests. So there's that history, there's the salience of genetics, the success of genetic research in many different contexts. I think all of that conspires to make, to support its greater visibility. But I think that also reflects poor training of science journalists. Science journalists ought to be trained to look more broadly at the whole spectrum of research that's going on, and not just at what is hot in a particular moment. So there's the training of journalists as well. That's a factor.
So, going back to the idea of implicit bias, there's an interesting way in which the results of science, which kind of have an implicit bias, can perpetuate those biases. So, if I had been presented with two men in the same position reaching for something from their pocket, my initial assumption would not have been cell-phone gun.
Mm.
But now that I've heard that, now that knowledge is in my head, that's the first thing that would come to my mind if presented with that kind of question. And the kind of identification of certain racial factors coming lead you to create biases that were the kind of the cause for even looking at that problem in the first place under the guise of race. And I'm wondering if the population level thinking that you are hoping to see more of will have any kind of benefit over the individualistic approach, or if the population approach is just an aggregate of individualistic data.
Okay, so yeah, good. So first of all, no, the population approach isn't really just an aggregate of individual data. Now, it's true that it's the behaviors or interactions of individuals that sort of produce the frequencies, right? But when the topic of interest is the frequency and different frequencies of behavior in different contexts, we're moving away from thinking about individuals and individual difference. So, yeah, I mean, I think it could, I wasn't talking about it as an alternative that could, on its own, diminish implicit bias, but it might have actually, if that kind of research were more salient than the individual-based research, it would cease the facilitation of the perpetuation of implicit bias that I think that the individual-based research can do. Yeah, so it's a slightly more complicated way of thinking about it, I think, but yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay. Well, if no more questions, please join me in thanking Professor Longino.